Well, shalom everyone, and welcome back to our class on the covenants. My name is Michael Gabizon, and I have the privilege, again, of walking with you through this important study, the study of the covenants of Scripture. Now, over the past few weeks, we have been looking at quite a few covenants, going from Adamic to Noahic to Abrahamic to Mosaic, and it could get a little confusing, and everything could kind of get muddled up, especially when we're talking about some of the responsibilities or conditional and unconditional, and considering the weeks in between, it might be hard to keep track of kind of who's in what covenant and what are the different covenants. So I created here a little bit of an outline that I think may be helpful when we look at the first Adamic covenant, right? This is the first one that we have, and the reason it's kind of broad like this is because it is made with the entire world. Now, in the Adamic covenant, what you have is, again, that kind of chaos to order, back to chaos, but in there, you have this hope of redemption, right? We live in a fallen state, but we're looking forward to when we will be in that Garden of Eden. We will be back in that place where we're able to fellowship with God continuously. And if you remember, in the midst of that judgment in the Adamic covenant, in Genesis 3, God gives the hope that there's going to be a future seed, the seed of the woman who's going to come and bring redemption. And so that's an important theme not to forget. I mentioned this before, and we are not able to go into it too much in the class, but the concept or the topic of covenants is often very related to messianism or prophecies about the Messiah. And so, hopefully at the end I could kind of put those two things together. But in the midst of these covenants, you also see a revelation of the Messiah, or at least a messianic hope. So the first covenant we have is the Adamic covenant. Then the next one after that is the Noahic covenant. Now this also, it looks the same because it was also made with the entire world. Now we spoke about this, how there are quite a few similarities between the two covenants, Adamic and Noahic, about populating, but there are also some important differences. And so it's important to keep these covenants distinct. They're not the exact same, but they are both made with the world, and they're both unconditional. So we finished with the Noahic in around Genesis 9, and then we got to the Abrahamic. And the Abrahamic covenant is where God moved from the covenants with the world, and he zoomed in on one people group. He zoomed in on Abraham, and then eventually Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's descendants. Now, in this covenant, this is also an unconditional covenant. Now, I put it underneath the Adamic and the Noahic, and the reason for that is because, technically, the Abrahamic covenant is still under that authority. However, here, with a specific people group, God is giving specific requirements. So God makes this covenant with Abraham, and this is unconditional. If you remember, he's the one who walks through the cut animals alone, right? So he goes through it. And what are the three promises? If you remember, if you could say them in your head at this point, I'll be very impressed, even though I can't hear you. But there were three main promises. You have the land, that they're going to own the land, that his descendants will own the land of Canaan, the seed, that he's going to have many, many descendants, although I'm going to argue not only is that true, but there's also the hope in there that there's going to be one specific descendant who is going to bring that redemption. So you have the land, you have the seed, and then finally you have a blessing for the entire world, that he's going to bless the entire world, or that God's going to bless the entire world through his descendants, which takes place in the future. And so here we have kind of like the three unconditional covenants. Now, last week, we looked at the Mosaic covenant. Now, the Mosaic covenant is different because it's a suzerain vassal treaty, meaning that it is conditional. But how would the Mosaic covenant really fit into this scheme? I would put it right here, because the Mosaic covenant, it really articulates the responsibilities of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? It tells them how they must live. And again, if we're to summarize it as a whole, the law, it is to love God and to love people. right? We spoke about the law last time and how there's some fluctuation, but nevertheless, it tells us the responsibilities they have, especially when they're in the land. And if they disobey God, they will be kicked out of the land. So this is a little chart here that hopefully provides some clarity as to how these covenants are kind of working together. And I think it's important to note, especially when I was working in ministry, a big argument that would come up is, are Gentiles under the Mosaic law, or should they obey the Mosaic law? And I think it's important, especially in this chart, to notice the Mosaic law is only made with the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, there are times, say in the Holiness Code in Leviticus, where it says that, if there's a sojourner or a ger who's with you, and he's in the land with you, or at least in a sacred place with you, he has to follow the law as well. It's not that they became Jewish or anything like that, but while they were in your midst, they had to obey the law. Nevertheless, the responsibilities of the Mosaic Code was only for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what we're going to look at today is actually a very short covenant. It's debated whether it even is a covenant, which I'm sure you're kind of used to this conversation. And it's the land covenant. And this is made in Deuteronomy 29 through 30. Okay, so I want to give some context about what happens in between, but this covenant is made all the way at the end of the Torah. So last class, we finished with Exodus 24. And this was when Moses, he finished off the Sinai covenant. They all made it, they all agreed, and everything was great. Throughout the rest of Exodus, you have a lot of the instructions about the tabernacle and building it, which represents, God's presence with them. So you have a lot of information there. But when the story continues, they're about to enter into Canaan, right? They're about to enter into this promised land, which is very exciting because, again, God's presence is connected with the land. So they're about to enter in, but Moses sends out 12 spies to go to go into Canaan to make sure everything's okay. 12 spies go. All of them come back. 10 of them say, it's a great land. Wonderful. However, there are giants there. We're going to be killed. We should never go, right? And so that really scares all the people. And they're like, oh my goodness, we don't want to go there. And what you see is a great distrust of God at that point, right? God brought them from Egypt. He brought them to Sinai, made the covenant. They're about to go in. But then there was that lack of faith, that lack of trusting. Remember, we spoke about how Abraham didn't have all the answers, but he followed in faith. And Moses didn't have all the answers, but he followed in faith. Israel here was not expressing faith in God. And so this led to God bringing a judgment on the people. They were condemned to travel around for 40 years in the wilderness. The reason is so that generation who did not trust God would die off. Now, some people, like the two good spies who said, no, we should go, we should get in, though Caleb and Joshua, they were able to enter into the land. However, the rest of the generations, they passed away. And so finally, after 40 years, now we're kind of getting towards, in Deuteronomy, we're in the plains of Moab, we're about to enter into Canaan, and this is where Moses essentially gives the book of Deuteronomy, which in Greek means second law. And the reason is because it's really a reiteration or a retelling of the Torah. So you open up into Deuteronomy, you see a lot of the same laws that you saw in Exodus. There are some things that are different. It's really interesting to do a comparison between the two. But when you're coming to the end of Deuteronomy, this is where you come to this statement. These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them at Horeb. Now, Horeb is Mount Sinai. So here we have a covenant that Moses is making besides the one that was made at Mount Sinai. And this is why people think this is an individual, distinct, different covenant, right? And so the name often given to this covenant that we're going to discuss in Deuteronomy 29 and 30 is the land covenant. If you look at older systematic theology books or just some older books that kind of treat this covenant, they will probably call it the Palestinian covenant. Obviously, that title is a little bit more contentious today, and so land covenant is usually what it's called at this point. But the main purpose of this covenant is really how to live in the land. It's how to prosper and how to survive in the land, but it also prophesies an expulsion from the land. It tells Israel what to expect going into the future. So it is an important covenant. I generally don't spend too much time on it. Like I tell my students, if we're doing a class on the covenants, even if the land covenant did not exist, we still have the promise of the covenant in the Abrahamic covenant, right? The land, seed, blessing. You still have the promise of the land there. So I view the land covenant as kind of an extension, a kind of elaboration of that initial promise. So we won't spend too much time there, but again, the main purpose is that it's telling them how to prosper in the land, and it's telling them what will happen in the future. But here's the amazing thing. God promises that they're going to be expelled from the land, kicked out because of their disobedience, that the land itself is going to be kind of wiped clean. But God promises he will restore them, and he promises the circumcision of the heart. And this is the first place that you have where it speaks about the circumcision of the heart. And that becomes a major theme when you're talking about the new covenant, when you're talking about Jeremiah and Ezekiel, because the circumcision of the heart means that God is able to take the law, take his commands, and place them on our heart so that we live in obedience to God continuously. A new heart, having the Spirit in us. So let's take a moment, let's go through this together. Kind of a quick little outline here. The first thing is that, of course, there is a debate. Is this its own covenant? Is this a distinct covenant from the Mosaic covenant? Now, again, some people say, no, Deuteronomy 29, it just kind of summarizes what we read in Deuteronomy. Other people say, no, this is a brand new covenant. Still others say we have absolutely no idea. I have a quote here from a scholar. The significance of the second covenant has never been satisfactorily explained. And I love that. Like there's a lot of debate around it. Is it its own covenant? So I'll just kind of tell you a little bit of what I'm thinking as we go through this here. When you look at Deuteronomy 29, 1 through 2, I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that leans in the direction that this is a new and distinct covenant, a different one than what you find with the Mosaic one. The first thing to notice, when it says, these are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make, in Hebrew, this is the verb karat. Now, if you remember from our conversation about the Noahic covenant, our conversation about the Abrahamic covenant, karat is used usually for making new covenants, right? Karat means cut. When you would cut a covenant, this is usually made for new covenants. Kum was the one for kind of reestablishing a covenant. So the language here, the first thing is that the language kind of reflects a new covenant. The second thing is that it articulates that this covenant is the one besides the covenant made at Mount Sinai. So in response, some people say, well, Mount Sinai and Deuteronomy are kind of two covenants, but really the same. But I think that this statement here, that this covenant is besides the one that was made at Sinai is very important, right? This tells us, no, this is a distinct, different covenant. The third thing is that when you're actually reading through in Deuteronomy 29, verse 12, God is speaking in the present tense. He's speaking about them entering into this covenant, right? It says, so that you may enter into the covenant which the Lord your God, and into his oath which the Lord your God is making with you today. He's making it with them today, but 40 years ago, they already entered into the Mosaic covenant. So I don't think that we could say this is the Mosaic covenant or kind of a reaffirmation of it. I think that the land covenant is a distinct covenant. So we'll treat it that way for our time together today. So the debate, is it its own covenant? I would say yes. The purpose of this covenant is really the focus on the land. So when you actually read through Deuteronomy 29, and I would encourage you to do so, in Deuteronomy 29, you have a little bit of a historical prologue, meaning, a bit of an account of what happened over the past 40 years. And one emphasis is how God preserved Israel and that they were able to conquer land and also settle in that land, right, as they're wandering and then when they're in the plains of Moab. And so there's an emphasis that they're able to be in the land and to be able to survive well. And then you have this concluding statement, so keep the words of this covenant to do them so that you may prosper in all that you do. And so a main emphasis of the land covenant is how to prosper in the land. The question is not ownership. They already own the land from the Abrahamic covenant. The question is possession and enjoyment of the land. Because if they disobey, as we're going to find out, if they disobey, they will be kicked out of the land. So, main purpose here is the focus on the land and how to enjoy it. Now, one point I like to highlight, and again, I said it before, and I will probably keep saying it throughout the class, the covenants that are based on this Abrahamic covenant, this unconditional covenant. When you're reading through Deuteronomy 29, you see a reference to the Abrahamic covenant. You see kind of how the land covenant is connected to that Abrahamic covenant. God says, in order that he may establish you today as his people, and that he may be your God, just as he spoke to you, and as he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, what did he swear to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He swore the Abrahamic covenant, not the Mosaic covenant. Right? So some people say, Israel's possession of the land was based on the Mosaic covenant, but that's broken, so they don't own the land anymore. No. The land covenant was based on the Abrahamic one. And it says it right here, Deuteronomy 29:13. It's what God swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Interestingly enough, in Deuteronomy 5 itself, it says that the Mosaic covenant was never made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so what we see right here, it cannot be the Mosaic law. It has to be the Abrahamic covenant. So again, this whole thing assumes, this whole language from the land covenant, it assumes Israel's possession and ownership of the land. They have that land because God gave it to them. The main question is, will they be able to possess it and live in it and prosper? So we have it grounded in the Abrahamic covenant. Next, the parties of the covenant, meaning who's actually involved in this covenant. Remember that chart I showed you, Adamic, Noahic, right? That's made with the world, but then Abrahamic, that's more specific. So who is the land covenant made with? Obviously, the Lord is one of the key parties, and he makes it both with Israel as well as with all their descendants. So notice what he says here. Now, not with you alone am I making this covenant and this oath, but both with those who stand here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, and with those who are not with us today. And this is really important because it's showing us not only is it made with Israel, but it's made with all their future descendants as well, going into today, just like the Abrahamic covenant. And so when anyone comes and they say, oh yes, the land covenant was just for Israel living in the Old Testament, but now that's done away with. No, the parties of the covenant are with Israel and all their descendants. It is still a covenant that is intact today. So knowing who the parties are is really important. And, when you look at church history, when you look at Christian commentators, there's kind of this idea that, after the rejection of Yeshua, in the New Testament, when the temple was destroyed and Israel was sent out, like that was it. The land was no longer important. But what we're going to see is that actually expulsion from the land, being expelled, was prophesied by God. And yet he gives a future hope that he's going to bring them back. Once again, kind of emphasizing the grace of God in the midst of what we can say is bad news. So the parties, when you're thinking about the parties, who is actually involved in this covenant, think about that it's the Lord and all of Israel as well as all of their descendants. Now, the land covenant does have a prophetic warning in it. God tells Israel that when you enter into the land, that you're going to prosper, you're going to enjoy it. But he warns them, don't commit adultery. Idolatry, sorry. Don't commit adultery either, but don't commit idolatry. Don't go after other gods. He says, so that there will not be among you a man or a woman, family or tribe, whose heart turns away from the Lord your God to go and to serve the other gods of the nation. And so there's this warning that if you go out and you serve other gods, that's when judgment is going to come. So it seems like a fair warning. It seems like a fair stipulation, right? I'm going to bring you into the land. You're going to enjoy it because you own that land. But if you commit idolatry, you will be kicked out of the land. That sounds like a good warning. But even in this land covenant, Moses says to Israel, you have a hard heart. You have ears, but you don't hear. It's showing that you have a hard heart that's going to end in sin. And this is why a little bit later, it says that they will be expelled from the land. That it says that even a foreigner, someone who doesn't even know God, is going to walk by the land and say, why has the Lord done this? Right? It says all the nations will say, why has the Lord done this to the land? Why this great outburst of anger? And then the men will say, and this is the key part, because they forsook the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of Egypt. And so what this is telling us is that the disobedience against God, the disobedience against the Mosaic covenant, is what's going to lead to their expulsion out of the land. Now, this could sound like very, very bad news. On the one hand, there's a bit of grace. We're expecting to be expelled. We know that we don't lose the land forever. But imagine being told you're entering this covenant, you're going to go into the land, but you have a hard heart. And so therefore you're going to be expelled. That might not be a very encouraging message, but that's why the land covenant is very important, because you have this final point, which is the future promise, the circumcision of the heart. God says in Deuteronomy 30 verse 3, then the Lord your God, he will restore you from your captivity and have compassion on you and will gather you again. So Israel is spread all over the world. God is going to have compassion. He's going to bring his people back to the land. But then notice, because we could say, okay, we were expelled because of our sin, but we're going to be brought back. But then what's going to change, right? Remember with the Noahic covenant, Genesis 6, everyone was sinful. They had an evil heart. God sent the flood, but the heart of man was still wicked, right? So then is that going to be the same thing here? God's going to bring Israel back, but their heart is still wicked. But this is where you have the beautiful promise, Deuteronomy 30 verse 6. It says, moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants. Now, again, this notion of circumcising the heart is something that you find a lot in the new covenant, in this anticipation that you find with Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that God's going to restore his people and that he's going to circumcise their hearts. But what does that actually mean? And he tells us right here in Deuteronomy 30 verse 6, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, so that you might live. Right? So the circumcision of the heart is when the law will be placed on our heart and we're going to live out the loving God and loving our neighbor perfectly and in harmony with God, so that we can live and prosper in this land that represents God's presence. Now, of course, the question is, did this take place, or when will it take place? People who say that the land covenant is fulfilled will often say, the expulsion, meaning when you were expelled from the land, that took place at the Babylonian exile, right, in 586. Also the Assyrian exile in 722, that already took place. They were out of the land and then God restored them. So this is kind of done away with, right? We already had that expulsion and the bringing back. While that makes sense, kind of when you're kind of stepping kind of far away from the text, when you read it carefully, and especially this description of the circumcision of the heart, I would say that it was not fulfilled back then when they were brought together. I think that Israel is still in the diaspora. We're still looking forward to a regathering, and that the circumcision of the heart is still a future event, because the way Jeremiah explains it is that people will not need to learn about God, that they're going to know him. They won't need to teach their neighbor. They're going to know him and enjoy his presence. So all that to say, the land covenant is still intact. This expulsion, we're still looking forward to that regathering and that circumcision of the heart that makes us complete, which I believe would take place in the millennium. So how does this kind of fit into our chart from what we looked at? Now, if you remember, we have here the Adamic covenant, the Noahic, then we looked into the Abrahamic, land, seed, blessing, and then the Mosaic are the responsibilities for the sons of Jacob. And then if we were to plug in the land covenant, I would say that it is an extension of the promise of land. With Abraham, God promised that his descendants would possess the land forever. Then the land covenant sort of explains you're going to possess it, you'll be kicked out for disobedience, but you'll be brought back into the presence of God. You'll be brought back to a sacred land, and God will circumcise your hearts. So a couple of conclusions and a couple of points to take away from this. First, always remember that when it comes to the land, that it's the difference between ownership and possession and enjoyment. Israel owns the land because God gave it. The question is their possession of it and their enjoyment of it, which is contingent on obedience. And this is really important to remember because, again, in church history, especially with the destruction of the temple and the expulsion of the people, or the expulsion of Israel from the land, that was used as proof that God has done away with the Jewish people. Right? I have here a quote from Origen, church father, and this is from his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. And notice what he says here. Therefore he, God, also having separated from her, Israel, so that means that, Israel is done away with, separated from her, married, so to speak, another, who is the church, having given into the hands of the former. So God gave into the hands of Israel the bill of divorcement, wherefore they can no longer do the things enjoyed to them by the law, because of the bill of divorcement. And what is the sign of this divorce? What is the sign that God is done away with the Jewish people? And a sign that she has received the bill of divorcement is this, that Jerusalem was destroyed along with what they call the sanctuary of the things in it. Jerusalem was destroyed. They were kicked out. That is the proof that God has done away with them. No. What we see in the land covenant is that that very thing was prophesied. Instead of saying that God is done with the Jewish people, we should be anticipating when God will bring the Jewish people back. So you can see how even the expulsion or being kicked out of the land has been misunderstood. Another common interpretation that kind of says, okay, the land is no longer important. This is found among New Testament scholars sometimes, and it's from the book of Acts. If you open Acts 1, you have here the people, they're waiting for the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And as they're there, you have this interesting statement where they approach the Lord, and it says, so when they came together, they were asking him, saying, Lord, is it at this time that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Right? Is it at this time that the kingdom is going to come out, that we're going to finally have a fulfillment of, the Davidic kingdom, which we're going to talk about in the next covenant? And he said to him, Yeshua said, it is not for you to know the times. Right? It's not for you to know. Instead, what does he tell them to do? He tells them to be my witnesses to the remotest parts of the earth. And so some people take this and say, you see, the land is no longer important. Now you're just supposed to go out, and now, you're not supposed to focus on the land anymore. I don't read it that way at all. I don't think, Yeshua is saying, that old kingdom thing, that old land thing, no, that's done away with. Don't even worry about that, right? It wasn't like a, trial and error type of thing. Yeshua doesn't say forget about it. He says, look, at this point, right, we're still kind of in the diaspora. At this point, go out, proclaim the gospel. That's still something that's going to happen in the future. So I don't think that we should just neglect the land. I think it's a very important part of God's covenant, and that we need to take it seriously as well. So the first thing to remember is that ownership of the land is different than possession and enjoyment. right? Those things are the reason Israel could be kicked out. The second thing to remember is this hope and anticipation of the circumcision of the heart, that we're still looking forward to the time when we will be able to obey God in perfect harmony, in perfect unity together, and sing his praises. So that closes the land covenant and the Torah as a whole. And so again, kind of like when I said that, in the first 20 chapters of Genesis, you have a lot of covenants. Well, when you close the Torah, you have a ton of covenants that we've already dealt with. So the Torah is very foundational and very important for understanding the scriptures. In our next class, we're going to go to our second to last covenant, the Davidic covenant. This is the covenant God made with David and with all of his descendants. And this is a very important one in order to understand when you get to the New Testament, some of the language that's used, as well as the hope for a future Davidic king. So I would encourage you, as homework for next week, read through 2 Samuel 7. Okay, 2 Samuel 7. This is where the Davidic covenant is made. It's only a total of about 7 verses, right? It starts at about verse 10, goes to about verse 17, 18. Read through it and see if you could find some of the stipulations or some of the commands that God makes, and if you could understand the Davidic covenant by reading it through. All right, so until the next week, I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
גפר עלינו הסתום, ואמת אדוני לעולם, הללויה, הללויה. כי גפר עלינו הסתום, ואמת אדוני לעולם, הללויה, הללויה, הללויה. Adonai